All right, good morning. Welcome back to the hangar. My buddy asked me to explain the process of a repair I did to this lip on this, or edge of this trunk gap here. And he's got some still shots I sent him, but I could stick my finger between the gap between this panel, which is an aftermarket panel, and the trunk lid, and it then angled to being correct all the way up in here to about a 3/16 gap, which is what we're after. And that kind of stuff just drives me crazy. And that's the issue with a lot of the replacement panels. They just don't fit well. You can spend as much having somebody make the panel fit as you spend on the panel. So, as you can see now, the gap on that trunk line is pretty nice. A little bit more tweaking, but we made a replacement piece. From here, it comes up, rolls over this lip, and then it was welded continuously along this line. And then that was the welds were ground, etc. I did a video for him on patching a panel, so it would tie in with that. So we will continue inside with how we did it. Okay, so we're back inside now to pick up where we left off on illustrating how I made that repair panel so that the gap between the trunk lid and the opening for it would have a consistent 3/16 or thereabouts. So what I've done here is I've just taken a piece of sheet metal and I've cut a hunk off of it. It's not real heavy gauge, so it would be a little easier for me to manipulate. And I have it clamped to a 2x4 and the 2x4 and the panel I'm going to be using to illustrate how I did this, they're all clamped to the table. Now, there's expensive equipment that you can buy to do this type of thing. If you're building your own car, you're building one car, the ends may not justify the means, or you may not have the floor space, so on and so forth. It can be done with cheap tools. So I just used a pair of snips and cut myself a piece of steel here to illustrate how I was doing that. And then what you're going to need is what's called a buck, which in this case is this 2x4, and they're usually made of wood. And then you're going to make your metal follow the shape of the buck. Now you can get a router pretty cheaply, and you can put about any kind of edge you want on a 2x4 or some piece of wood, and then you're going to use that to bend your panel around. So what I had to do is emulate the same curve or same radius that was in the rest of that trunk opening, so that it wouldn't look like I was ever there. So I'm going to illustrate how I did that. So with this clamped up, you can bend this over this lip. You can just use your hands, or you can get a body hammer, or any kind of a hammer for that matter, and get it bent. And I'll show you another way that you can bend these panels using a vise if the piece is small enough. In the case of our trunk lid opening out there, for the opening for the trunk lid, panel was far too large to fit into a vise. So I'll pick up in a minute over on the other bench. All right, so you can use a bench vise as well, if the part you're making obviously will fit in it. Now, typically, this is the jaws of this vise are going to give you too sharp an angle for most things, so you're going to need some type of median in there to radius of your curve a little softer. Now in this case I've used another highly technical piece of equipment called a piece of cardboard, and I've just bent that, and now what I'm going to do is clamp this up, and then we can just simply press that over, or if it's heavier gauge metal you can use a hammer, and if you're worried about beating up the piece of steel, put a piece of wood between the piece of steel and your hammer so it doesn't leave hammer marks on your repair panel. So that's all there is to that. Now, in the case of the Camaro, the panel also had an arc in it as the trunk falls off towards the back of the car. So there's a couple of different ways you can do that as well. One of them is with the shrinking tool, and I've mounted one here in my vise, the other vise, and you can pick these shrinking tools up relatively cheaply at a lot of places. I got this one at the China store, aka Harbor Freight, and you just slide the panel in there between the jaws, and then you're gonna force it down like this, and what it does is essentially bites that metal, which pulls it in, which then causes it to shrink, and you can start to arc it that way. They make a mount for these where you can, instead of using your hand, you can use your foot, and those are great, but they occupy floor space, which I don't have a whole hell of a lot of, so I've just got mine in the vise. These come with jaws, a different set of jaws that actually will stretch metal. Now the other thing you can do is you can notch the piece of sheet metal, and you can do that in different places, and that will usually allow you to then bend it. Once it's bent, then you're going to weld those spots where you cut it so that you've got a solid piece of steel again that's in the shape you want. So there you are. That's more on panel repair and how I did that. My buddy seems to think that somebody might watch these. He said some people had. I'm not entirely convinced it's not just him at home clicking on his thing so he could be right. And he's been right before. I specifically remember the last time was December 7th, 1989. Yeah, he made a really good point then. Thank you. All right, we're back here at the hangar. Thought I'd show you a couple more high-tech tools. Panel gaps, really important. If they're not even, the car is just going to look out of kilter. So I'm sure they make some tool for this, but what I use is paint sticks with a piece of 80 grit wrapped around both sides of it, just like that. I used to just use the paint stick by itself, and that's a nice gap. The problem is that by the time you get the various primers, epoxy and build prime, and then a base coat of paint and then clear coat, those gaps shrink, and the paint stick by itself was not enough. The gaps got too tight, and you would occasionally get a fender that would rub the door, or the door rather would rub the fender. So just that little bit of added thickness of the sandpaper on there makes a big difference. So another pro tip from the hangar here.